I went to a restaurant with my wife, one of those nights when routine made us believe that everything was still peaceful. We ordered a bottle of wine, she smiled, fixed her hair like she did when she wanted to look in love, and for a moment, I thought we were really fine. But then he arrived. A man in a dark suit, with a firm gaze, and determined steps. He came straight to our table, as if he were going to get something that belonged to him. Without hesitation, without disguise, he simply extended his hand to her. I didn't understand. I asked what he wanted, who he was, why he approached my wife as if she were his. He looked me in the eyes with cold calm and said, "I thought she told you." My world stopped. The waiter walked away. The wine warmed in the glass. My blood froze. I answered without thinking, "She didn't tell me anything." When I looked into her eyes, I knew. I didn't need any more words. Time seemed to fold in on itself and, in that moment, my marriage ended. Not there, officially, but something inside me died without warning. I didn't scream, I didn't cause a scene. I just took a deep breath, stood up, left the card on the table and left. I went home with shaking hands, a broken heart and only one certainty: I needed to start planning my life without her. The next few days were silent, cold, endless. She didn't come home that night. Or the night after. When she finally did, she told me she needed time, that she was confused, that she was figuring out who she was. I didn't question her. I just listened, like a bystander to my own downfall. I asked for a divorce without raising my voice. She cried. She said that wasn't what she wanted. But I already understood, she didn't cheat on me by accident. It wasn't an impulse. It was a choice. And choices have consequences. We signed the papers weeks later, without witnesses, without emotion. She walked out the front door as if she were going to the grocery store. I stood in the hallway, listening to her footsteps retreat, unsure whether to breathe a sigh of relief or grief. The months passed like slow knives cutting through routine. The memories, the smells, the silences of a home that was now mine alone, hurt like open wounds. Our children, now adults, respected my pain with the dignity of those who also felt their own. They never took sides, never shouted, but they knew. They knew that something had been broken forever. And although they still loved their mother, something in her had changed for them too. Over time, a new name began to appear in my conversations. A new voice appeared in my life. Someone who listened to me without judging, who saw my cracks and still chose to stay. He didn't seek to fill the space that his former wife left, he just helped me not to fall into it. But fate, ironic as always, doesn't let certain wounds heal without one last blow. One day, she came back. Thinner, more tired, more silent. She said she had been left by the man who thought he was all she needed. That now she saw what she had lost. She asked for forgiveness. She said she remembered me in every little solitude of the day. That no one made coffee like me, that no laugh was like mine. But I was no longer the same man she left. I had learned to walk again. And there was someone by my side now. Someone who didn't want to save me, but to accompany me. It was at that time that something happened. My children came to visit me. We were in the garden, laughing at an old video they had found on my cell phone. She showed up, unannounced, like someone trying to find a home through nostalgia. She looked at them with tears in her eyes and tried to get closer. They hugged her respectfully. But when my new companion appeared on the porch with a juice in her hands, they ran to her. One of them said, "She does our father a lot of good." And then they called her Mom. Not out of anger. Not out of revolt. But because time teaches who deserves certain titles. She listened. And in her eyes, at that moment, I saw everything she had never told me: remorse, regret, the awareness of what she had destroyed. That was the beginning of a long road of overcoming. But what she did after that, well, that was what really shocked me. Because there is a kind of regret that eats away at you from the inside and, silently, transforms you. The way she tried to recover what she lost, the method, the gestures, what she discovered, was so unexpected that to this day I wonder, what if she had told me everything from the beginning? What if I had done something different that night at the restaurant? But what she did, that, no one could have foreseen. Welcome to the channel. Here, we make something very clear: we do not support, encourage or romanticize any type of betrayal. All the stories told are fictional, but the feelings they provoke are real, because the moral behind each of them is to show how betrayal has the power to destroy lives, homes and trusts that took years to build. Prepare yourself. What you're going to hear now is an intense story, full of twists and turns, and that can leave you speechless. Press play and dive into a drama that will keep you hooked until the very last second. Daniel and Clara were the kind of couple who, when observed from a distance, would arouse the discreet admiration of those who still believed in mature love. Together for almost 15 years, they built a life that did not attract attention for ostentation or great public achievements, but for the solidity of small gestures. They had 2 children, both teenagers, and lived in a corner house with a well-kept garden, where Sunday afternoons were often filled with laughter, the smell of fresh food and old songs playing softly in the background. Daniel was a civil engineer, practical and silent, one of those men who carry more intensity in their gaze than in their words. Clara, on the other hand, had an energy that filled the spaces. He spoke with his hands, laughed with his eyes, and wherever she was, the atmosphere seemed more alive. When they met, while still in college, they were attracted by the differences that would later become the point of balance between them. He sought ground, she offered sky. And so, they walked together, adjusting their steps over the years. They learned early on that love alone was not enough to sustain a relationship. They invested in dialogue, shared routines, and mutual respect. Clara used to say that the basis of marriage was a sincere look after a difficult day, that moment when, even without saying anything, one knew exactly how the other was doing. Daniel liked the way she organized the details of life, from their children's school schedules to family trips, with an almost poetic lightness. As pragmatic as he was, he did not hide his enchantment with the way Clara took care of the home, their relationships, and, most importantly, the way she was able to make others feel special. She made him laugh on difficult days, even when he insisted on keeping to himself, and he made her feel safe in a world where everything was fickle. In the early years of their marriage, they faced the typical challenges of adult life, starting their careers, paying rent, bills that barely made ends meet, sleepless nights because of the baby's colic. There were nights when they argued quietly so as not to wake their children, and others when they slept with their backs turned, swallowing words that were too harsh to say. But in those moments, they found a way to come back together. Clara had a habit of leaving notes in Daniel's wallet whenever he left for work trips, and Daniel made sure to bring something symbolic when he returned, a bookmark, a miniature of a city, a handwritten letter. Over time, these traditions became part of their identity. Nothing was extraordinary, but everything was real. And, deep down, that was what sustained them. The routine with the children was also full of complicity. The eldest, Sophia, had inherited Clara's sensitivity, but also her intense temperament. Lucas, the youngest, seemed like an emotional copy of his father, reserved, observant, with a look that said more than any sentence. Clara was the emotional center of the house, Daniel the silent foundation. Together, they led the family through the simple joys, homemade birthdays, walks in the park, Sundays playing board games, and the inevitable moments of tension, such as bad school reports, teenage existential crises, and the first heartbreaks. Despite the apparent stability, as in any long-term relationship, there was a certain wear and tear that crept in unnoticed. It wasn't a lack of love, but the constant presence of obligations. Dinners for 2 became rare, replaced by quick meals between an online meeting and checking on schoolwork. Bedtime conversations became about bills, appointments, and shopping lists. Silences were no longer comfortable and began to carry a certain weight, a feeling that something needed to be said, but no one knew exactly what. Daniel, increasingly absorbed in work, believed that he was doing what was necessary to ensure the family's future. Clara, in turn, began to feel that she was disappearing into the routine, becoming part of the furniture in the house that she herself organized. Even so, she tried hard to rekindle the flame between them. She planned little surprises, like preparing his favorite dish on random days, or suggesting different outings so they could get out of their ruts. Daniel, grateful, smiled, but rarely returned the smile with the same intensity. Not for lack of love, but because he didn't realize that Clara also needed to be taken care of. He thought that demonstrating stability was enough proof of dedication. And while she asked for more emotional presence, he offered material security, without realizing that this no longer filled the voids that were opening up inside her. Clara tried to talk to them a few times. She said she felt lonely even though she was married, and that she wanted to recapture the lightness they had at the beginning. Daniel listened, promised to improve, made a momentary effort, but soon lost himself again in his daily obligations. There were no fights, shouting or betrayals. At least not yet. Just a growing silence between them, a distance that could not be seen with the naked eye, but which could be felt in their increasingly automatic gestures. The good morning kisses became brief, the hugs became rarer, and the exchanges of affection became more bureaucratic than spontaneous. She began to look for new ways to reconnect with who she was before she became a wife and mother. She went back to taking dance lessons, started going out with old friends, and rediscovered the pleasure of being alone in a coffee shop reading a good book. At no point was this done out of rebellion or resentment. It was an attempt to reclaim herself, to remember who she was before becoming part of a couple. Daniel, in turn, saw these changes with a mixture of admiration and discomfort. He thought it was beautiful that Clara was taking care of herself, but he also felt that she was slipping through his fingers, like sand on a windy day. The children noticed the changes in the air, even if no one spoke about them. Sophia became quieter and more observant, while Lucas asked disconcerting questions, such as why his parents no longer slept as close together on the couch as before. Clara tried to keep everything in order, striving to keep the house a refuge, but inside, she felt more and more like a visitor in her own story. Daniel, without realizing how distant he was, believed that all he had to do was keep everything working for love to sustain itself. He still loved her, it was true, but he had forgotten that love also needs maintenance, emotional nourishment, and sincere presence. When they had been married for 13 years, Clara suggested a trip for the two of them. A weekend away, to reconnect. Daniel agreed, but postponed it twice because of work. When they finally traveled, the place was beautiful, the hotel comfortable, but there was something between them that not even the landscape could dissolve. Their conversation was slow, full of long pauses and awkward smiles. They slept hugging each other, but they didn't touch each other. The lack of intimacy hurt more than any fight. When they got back, Clara cried in the shower, Daniel drank a glass of wine alone on the balcony. Neither of them knew exactly what was wrong, they just felt that something was not right anymore. Still, they persisted. They continued their routine, made plans for the following year, attended school reunions, visited her parents in the countryside. Like so many couples, they lived between the desire to reconnect and the fear of breaking up. There was no anger, but there was also no longer the lightness of the early years. Clara still made coffee for Daniel in the morning, and he still remembered to buy her favorite cookies at the market. But their eyes no longer sought each other in the same way. And it is always through the eyes that one realizes when love begins to fade. What Clara felt was not gratuitous dissatisfaction, nor a desire for adventure. It was an emotional need that grew slowly, like a silent mold on an unventilated wall. And what Daniel did not realize was that, by neglecting his wife's most subtle appeals, he was opening cracks. Cracks that, when not repaired, turn into abysses. And even when everything still seems whole on the outside, on the inside, the cracks have already begun to appear. In that house where everything seemed so right, where the routine flowed naturally and commitments were fulfilled with precision, something very deep was no longer aligned. And this misalignment, still invisible to the world, was the silent harbinger of a rupture that was to come. But at that time, no one talked about it. Everyone kept smiling at birthday photos, posting inspirational phrases on social media and asking each other how their day was. Everything went on, until it stopped. And when everything finally came to light, no one was ready. Because the greatest pain is not the betrayal itself, but the silence that precedes the scream. And that silence had been living in that house for a long time. Daniel was not the kind of man who perceived the subtleties of emotional time. He saw the world through direct lenses, as if everything that was in visible order was also whole on the inside. The marriage was going on, the children were growing up, the bills were paid, hugs were there, even if spaced out. The absence of explicit conflicts was, for him, proof enough that everything was still under control. But Clara had learned to silence pain masterfully. Over the years, she had developed the ability to smile without feeling, to talk without opening up, to love in silence even when love began to hide in discreet gaps. She still admired him, and perhaps even loved him, but there was something inside her that could no longer be filled with flowers on special occasions or family dinners on Sundays. The absence of a true look, of emotional presence, weighed more than any scream. And she no longer knew how to carry that weight alone. It was on one of those afternoons when Clara went out alone to clear her head, as she called it, that something changed. She was walking through a craft fair, distracted by the colorful cloths and the sound of a guitar playing in the background, when she ran into an old acquaintance from her youth. He was older than her and had only been a friend back when Clara still frequented coffee shops with her university friends. But there was an attentive manner about him that aroused her curiosity, a man who looked into her eyes patiently and listened with genuine interest. Their reunion was brief, a smile, an exchange of words, and, later that evening, a message on a social network. The kind that begins with, "It was nice to see you," and ends with, "Let's have a coffee sometime." There were no immediate ulterior motives. At least not conscious ones. Clara, deep down, needed to be heard. And he was willing to listen. Their meetings became frequent, always under the guise of an old friendship being rekindled. She talked about art, books, and her children, but avoided mentioning her husband's name. And when he asked about Daniel, she would deflect with vague phrases, saying that he was busy, hard-working, and a good father. But all it took was a longer pause for her eyes to lose their light and her voice to tremble slightly. He could tell. And it was in that gap that he settled in. With kindness, patience, and the kind of presence that Clara had not known for years. She found herself smiling again effortlessly, remembering what it was like to be desired, noticed, read between the lines. She wasn't looking for another man, but she found in him the image of everything she missed at home. And before she knew it, she was already telling secrets, confiding fears, opening doors that she had never opened, not even to Daniel. Meanwhile, Daniel continued to immerse himself in his routines. He lived with the feeling that life was a game of balancing work, family and commitments. In his free time, he liked to spend time in the garden, trimming plants or reading the news on his cell phone. Sometimes, he noticed Clara was more distant, more silent, but he interpreted this as tiredness. He was not an emotionally stupid man, but he had forgotten how to listen to what was unsaid. Clara left clues, a longer sigh in the kitchen, a cold response during dinner, a lost look after a kiss on the cheek. But Daniel did not follow clues. He believed that if something was wrong, she would say something. And since she did not say anything, he continued to believe. Then came their wedding anniversary. 15 years. Clara suggested a low-key dinner at a new Italian restaurant downtown. Daniel agreed, but he arrived home late from work, tense, with his cell phone still vibrating with messages. He kissed her on the forehead, sat down, ordered a bottle of wine, and started talking about a new project that was consuming him. Clara listened in silence. She was beautiful, wearing a dress that he didn't comment on, with her hair done up and a sweet perfume that he barely noticed. During dessert, she mentioned that she was thinking about taking a course outside the city, something to update herself professionally. Daniel said it was a good idea, that she deserved to invest in herself, but his answer was dull, as if he said it out of obligation. Clara smiled, thanked her, and in that smile, something inside her broke for good. It wasn't the course she wanted. It was the attention. It was the look. It was the enthusiasm that he no longer showed for anything that came from her. In the following weeks, the encounters with the other man intensified. Clara began to make plans, to work late, to go out on Saturday mornings with vague excuses. He didn't pressure her, he respected her. It was part of his essence to trust. And it was precisely this trust that became the fertile ground for error. Clara began to divide herself between two worlds. At home, she still took care of the children, laughed with them, helped with the chores, prepared dinners. But inside, I was in another place. A place where I was once again a woman before being a mother, before being a wife. Daniel, on the other hand, felt that something was changing, but he couldn't name it. He noticed the silences, the distractions, the absent kisses, but he always attributed it to routine, stress, time. Until the night at the restaurant came. Clara suggested the same place as their wedding anniversary. She said she wanted to have dinner again, that she missed some time alone together. Daniel thought it was strange, but he was happy with her initiative. They arrived together, she was radiant. They talked like they hadn't in a long time. She touched his arm, laughed more freely, talked about future plans, and for a moment he believed they were reconnecting. But deep down, Clara was nervous. Her gaze strayed to the entrance of the restaurant from time to time, and her hands discreetly clutched the napkin folded on the table. Daniel didn't notice. He was enchanted by her presence, as if he had found something he had lost for years. The wine arrived, they toasted. She said she was happy they were there, and he said he was too. But before the main course was served, a man approached the table. Tall, confident, with a dark suit and a determined expression. He didn't smile, he didn't hesitate. He stopped in front of them and looked directly at Clara. Daniel, confused, asked if he needed anything. And then came the phrase that froze everything around. "I thought she told you." The stranger's firm voice cut through the air like an invisible razor. Daniel looked at Clara for an explanation, but she had nothing left to hide. She just lowered her eyes. He then answered, swallowing hard, "She didn't tell me anything." At that moment, Clara's gaze slowly rose and met his. There was no more pretending. The air became dense, the noises of the restaurant disappeared, and all that remained was the weight of what was unsaid exploding like a truth impossible to avoid. The man extended his hand to her, and Clara, in a slow gesture, stood up. There was no scandal. Daniel just sat there, with his hands on the towel, his gaze lost, his soul imploding without sound. She went. The man took her. And Daniel was left alone. With the plate still warm, the wine half finished, and an avalanche of unanswered questions. But no answer mattered anymore. What mattered was what had just happened. What mattered was the silence in her eyes. What mattered was the touch she didn't refuse. What mattered was the certainty he had when she said nothing. The betrayal was not discovered. It was revealed in a gesture. In a look. In an absence. And in that moment, Daniel understood everything. Or almost everything. Because there was still something he didn't know. Something that would completely change the meaning of that night. And that was yet to come. Daniel spent the next few days immersed in a silent torpor, a kind of emotional anesthesia that prevented him from processing the pain clearly. He didn't cry, he didn't scream, he didn't ask why. He just walked around the house like a ghost of himself, opening doors, turning on lights, and turning them off minutes later without realizing it. Clara had gone out that night and never came back. She sent him a message 2 days later, asking him to respect her time, that she needed space, and that they would talk soon. But what was there to say? Daniel couldn't give shape to the chaos he felt inside. The betrayal hurt less because of the broken promise and more because of the coldness of the gesture. Because of the certainty that she was no longer his long before she walked out the door. But what he didn't know yet was that all of this wasn't the bottom of the barrel. There was still something else, a missing piece in this puzzle, something that explained the look in her eyes that night, a shadow behind the guilt. And he would only discover it at the most unexpected moment. It was on a Saturday morning, almost a month later, that Clara showed up unannounced. She knocked on the door with a haggard face, eyes without makeup, and a trembling voice. Daniel opened the door without saying anything, just stepped back, allowing her to enter. She walked around the room as if she no longer recognized herself in that space. She touched the back of the sofa, ran her fingers over a framed photograph of her children when they were still young, sighed, and sat down without permission. Daniel crossed his arms and waited. She began by saying that she knew she had no right to be there, but that she needed to talk. He responded with a simple, "Then talk," dry but firm. What she would say next was something he never imagined he would hear. Clara took a deep breath, looked at him with an expression somewhere between shame and despair, and then said that she wasn't there just to ask for forgiveness, nor to justify something that had no justification. She was there because there was something he didn't know yet. Something that would change everything. Daniel, still silent, felt his chest tighten. His eyes fixed on hers, trying to anticipate the blow. And then she told him. The first time Clara met that man, months ago, there was no intention. He was just a face from the past. But what Daniel didn't know was that that man hadn't appeared by chance. He had been introduced by someone very close to her. Sophia. Their daughter. Daniel's heart raced. He frowned and, in an incredulous tone, asked if he had understood correctly. Clara nodded, tears now streaming down her face. She explained that, in a moment of confiding between mother and daughter, she had talked about her feelings, about how invisible, exhausted, and erased she felt. Sophia, wanting to help, said that she knew someone, a friend's father, who was a mature, kind man who had also been alone for years. She said that perhaps a casual encounter, a coffee, a conversation without commitments, would help her mother rediscover herself as a woman. Clara, hesitant, rejected the idea. But days later, after another night in which she lay next to Daniel without hearing a single word of affection, she picked up the phone that Sophia had left on the table and sent a message. The revelation hit Daniel like an earthquake. His daughter. Their daughter. The girl he held in his arms, who taught her to ride a bike, who helped her through her anxiety attacks during college entrance exams. How could she get involved in something like that? But Clara interrupted him before he could react. She said that Sophia never meant any harm, that it was her idea, that her daughter never imagined that it would become anything more than a conversation. That she herself had never imagined it. But she was the one who allowed it to progress, she was the one who kept everything hidden, she was the one who nurtured the secret until it became an abyss impossible to cross. Daniel stood up suddenly and began to pace the room, his hands in his hair, his gaze lost. He kept saying that it couldn't be, that it was absurd, that it didn't make sense. Clara begged him to listen to her, to understand that Sophia was being emotionally manipulated, that the conversation had been misinterpreted, that everything had gotten out of control. But he couldn't listen anymore. A pain much deeper than the marital betrayal was now cutting him apart inside. The pain of realizing that his daughter, the person he protected most in the world, had been dragged into the most humiliating mistake of his life. That his own blood had been a witness, perhaps an accomplice, to the process that had destroyed his marriage. He turned and asked, "Did she know you slept together?" Clara hesitated, lowered her eyes, and said yes. That she had told Sophia weeks later, during an emotional breakdown, when everything was already done. And that her daughter, although shocked, had tried to hide it. She said she respected her decision, that she wouldn't judge, that she hoped she knew what she was doing. Daniel felt nausea rise up. He sat down with his hands on his face, his shoulders shaking. He wasn't crying yet, but he was on the verge of something irreversible. Clara knelt in front of him, tried to hold his hands, but he pushed them away. She said he needed to be alone. That he didn't know who she was anymore, that he didn't know who he was anymore, and that he didn't know how to look at his daughter without remembering all of this. Clara stood up, silently. She said she would respect his time, but that she needed to say that she regretted everything. Not just the betrayal, but having dragged Sophia into what should have been only her own ruin. That she would have to live with this for the rest of her life. And that if Daniel ever wanted to talk, she would be willing. But if he didn't, she would understand. Before leaving, she stopped at the door and said, in a weak voice, that she still loved him. And then she left, leaving Daniel among shards of memories and truths that were impossible to ignore. Hours later, he received a message from Sophia. A short one. It simply said, "Dad, we need to talk. Forgive me." He didn't respond right away. It took him days to process what he had heard. To retrace his steps, review his memories, reevaluate the relationship I thought I knew so well. And when she finally sat down with her daughter, it wasn't with anger, but with a broken heart. Sophia cried for the first few seconds. She said she never wanted any of that to happen, that she wanted to help her mother, who was naive and stupid. Daniel listened to everything without interrupting. In the end, he just said that he needed time. That he still loved her, but he didn't know how to go on as if nothing had happened. The betrayal was already hurt enough. But discovering that the thread that connected the past to the present had been built with his daughter's participation opened up a new level of pain, denser, more silent. And at that moment, Daniel understood that some losses did not come only with absences, but with distorted presences. And that rebuilding his life would require more than forgiveness, it would require relearning to trust in the impossible. And from that moment on, his story would take a turn that even he could not have imagined. The time that followed the conversation with Sophia was filled with a dense silence that invaded Daniel's house like a permanent fog. He could no longer walk through the rooms without feeling the presence of what had been revealed, as if the walls now whispered distorted memories. He spent his days acting mechanically, waking up early, making coffee with automatic movements, leaving the TV on at a low volume just so as not to hear the sound of his own breathing. Sophia retreated into her own pain and, despite still living under the same roof, father and daughter barely exchanged words. Not out of resentment, but because they both knew that any misplaced sentence could open wounds that had barely healed. It was like walking on glass, each step required caution. Daniel tried to seek refuge in his work, but even there his concentration betrayed him. The computer was turned on and off countless times a day, reports piled up, and meetings became meaningless noise. His colleagues noticed his tired expression, his sunken eyes, his disarmed posture, but they didn't dare ask. There was no room for explanations. It was as if the outside world was unable to understand the complexity of what he was facing. And perhaps it shouldn't have. Some pains were too intimate to be shared without being lost in judgment or banality. It was during a solitary walk through the park where he used to go with Clara on Sundays that Daniel realized that he would not be able to rebuild his life in that ruined setting. That home, those walls, everything there carried not only memories, but also the constant feeling of betrayal, of exposure, of something that had been violated from the inside out. He then decided to rent a small apartment in another neighborhood. A place where the furniture had not been chosen by four hands, where the objects did not have shared stories. He wanted something new, not out of anger, but out of necessity. Sophia stayed in the house with her maternal grandparents, who moved in temporarily to help her reorganize her own feelings. The separation, although painful, was inevitable. They needed to breathe different air, find new ways of seeing each other. In his new apartment, Daniel rediscovered something he had forgotten: healthy silence. Not the kind that carries guilt and emptiness, but the kind that allows him to listen to his own thoughts without the interference of voices from the past. The nights were still long, but now they were filled with reading, old movies, and, occasionally, a glass of wine. Solitude was different. It no longer suffocated him, but rather instructed him. It showed him that he still existed outside of his role as a husband, a father, a wounded man. He began attending an emotional support group, where he met people who had different stories but similar pains. There, he learned to name his feelings, to understand that some falls do not require explanations, only acceptance and, with time, the courage to get back up. It was in this group that he met Helena. Different from Clara in every way, she was calm and spoke little, but with a comforting sweetness. She had lost her husband to cancer 2 years earlier and, since then, had been learning to rebuild her own world. Their first meetings were almost silent, full of pauses, glances, and mutual respect. Neither of them sought to fill in any gaps, they simply wanted to be understood. Helena did not ask invasive questions or seek explanations. She offered her presence. And for Daniel, that was more than enough. Over time, their meetings became more frequent. Coffees in the late afternoons, walks in parks, visits to small exhibitions. The simplicity between them was what made everything lighter. There was no urgency from the past, nor the obligation to keep up appearances. It was a relationship built on sincerity and real time. No rush, no empty promises. When Daniel decided to introduce Helena to his children, he did so with a heavy heart, but certain that he was not trying to replace anyone. You were just choosing to live again. Sophia, with tears in her eyes, hugged her father's new partner with a shy but sincere gesture. And Lucas, more discreet, just smiled and said he was happy to see him smile again. Clara found out about the new relationship a few weeks later, through a mutual friend. She called Daniel on a Friday afternoon. Her voice on the other end of the line was calm, almost too calm for someone who had already shared his life. She asked if they could talk. Daniel hesitated for a few seconds, but accepted. They arranged to meet at a discreet cafe. When she arrived, she was different. She was wearing simple clothes, without the usual prim and proper dress code she usually wore. She sat across from him with her eyes downcast, and for a while they were silent, just listening to the sound of cups being placed on the tables around them. It was Clara who started talking. She said she didn't expect forgiveness or reconciliation, but that she needed to say a few things. She talked about the therapy she was doing, about the sleepless nights, about the regret she carried not only for what she had done to him, but for what she had done to herself. She confessed that for a long time she had confused freedom with escape, passion with need, and that it took her a while to understand that no love justifies destroying a family. She said that the man she had been with left her days after the separation, saying that she wasn't what he expected, that she was too full of the past. And that was when she understood that she had only been a temporary mirror for his ego. A distraction. And now, all she had left was the feeling of emptiness and the certainty that she had lost the only man who had truly known her completely. Daniel listened attentively. There was no anger in his eyes, but there was no room to go back either. He said he didn't wish her harm, that he still respected her as the mother of his children, but that there was no more love between them. At least not the kind of love that sustains life as a couple. He spoke of Helena, how much peace he felt with her, and how he had learned to breathe again. Clara tried to smile, but her eyes filled with tears. He said she had no right to ask for anything more, but that she was happy that he was okay. As they said goodbye, she lightly touched his hand and said, "You've always been my home. But I chose to leave. And now I know that you don't go back home as if nothing had happened." The last piece of that cycle fell into place. Daniel left the cafe feeling something he hadn't felt in a long time, lightness. He had finally closed that chapter. Not with shouting or forced reconciliations, but with the truth, spoken with maturity and pain. When he got home that night, he was greeted with a hug from Helena and a table set with 2 simple dishes. They sat down, ate in silence, and at one point she touched his hand and said, "You've come back to yourself." Daniel didn't answer. He just squeezed her hand and smiled. He was no longer the betrayed, humiliated, wounded man. He was now the man who survived, who had weathered the storm and found on the other side not a new love, but himself, whole again. Without having to prove anything to anyone, without carrying the weight of what had been destroyed. Now, he walked lightly. And next to someone who loved him exactly for who he had become after the chaos. And there, on that ordinary night, between 2 glasses of wine and a light laugh, Daniel was certain, it was possible to start over without forgetting, it was possible to be happy after the end. And that, sometimes, the justice of destiny did not come as punishment, but as reflected truth. And this truth, he would carry forever, with gratitude, not for having suffered, but for having survived. The meeting with Clara at the cafe did not mean an immediate end, but it was the definitive sign that a phase was coming to an end. Daniel left that place with his body relaxed, as if he had finally allowed himself to let go of a burden he had been carrying without even realizing it. There was no more anger, nor sadness, just the complete acceptance that there was nothing that could be recovered from what had been destroyed, and that the only thing that could be done with the rubble was to learn to live among it or choose to rebuild somewhere else. He had chosen the second option. It was the hardest decision, but also the most honest. The scars did not disappear, but they began to be part of the new landscape of his soul. He returned to his routine without needing to prove to himself or to others that he had overcome, because the simple fact of continuing to live with serenity was already the greatest possible answer. Helena's presence in his life began to take on more intimate and solid contours. The relationship established itself as a safe haven, without demands, without the weight of comparisons with the past. There was a silent understanding between them, a kind of invisible contract that both knew the value of what they were building. She did not invade Daniel's space, but she also did not allow him to sink into old silences. She was the type of woman who spoke little, but knew exactly when to say something that mattered. She did not judge him for the pain he still carried, she simply respected it, understanding that some parts of him would always belong to a past that no new love could erase. Over time, Daniel noticed a profound change in the dynamics with his children. Lucas, always observant, began to ask more open questions, wanting to better understand his father as a man and not just as an authority figure. The two began going out together on Saturdays, sometimes to walk, other times to chat in a coffee shop. Sophia, on the other hand, still oscillated between careful approaches and sudden withdrawals. Even after their conversation, she carried layers of guilt that were difficult to remove. There was a constant attempt to make up for it in her gestures, from the way she offered to help, to the longer hugs, as if she wanted to assure him that he was still there, that he had not rejected her. Daniel never pushed her away, but he also did not pretend that everything was the same. They were rebuilding something new, based on another truth, much more difficult, but more sincere. Time passed and, with it, life regained its strength. The relationship with Helena became natural within the family, although Daniel avoided any kind of imposition. The children treated her politely and, over time, with true affection. Sophia, surprisingly, began to see her with special respect. Perhaps because she saw in her exactly what her mother had lacked in recent years, sweet firmness, emotional constancy, love without ego. One day, at a dinner at home, Helena got up to serve dessert and Sophia said, almost without thinking, "Let me bring it, Mom." An immediate silence fell over the table. Daniel slowly looked up, Helena smiled, and Sophia put her hand to her mouth, startled. But instead of correcting him, she added, "You take care of him like no one else." "I didn't mean to be offensive. It's just that, sometimes, it really does seem like it." Helena held her hand and gently replied that she would understand if she was never called that, but that she was there whenever they needed her. From that night on, their relationship took on a different tone. Closer, more open. There was no need for titles. Just presence. Clara, on the other hand, remained absent, although she kept in touch with her children. She tried to rebuild her image little by little, avoiding invading the spaces she had lost. She lived alone in a small apartment, gave private lessons and devoted herself to therapy seriously. From afar, Daniel heard Sophia's stories about how his mother was changing. He was not excited or doubtful. He just accepted it. He knew that some people do change, but not always in time to repair the damage caused. And it was no longer up to him to determine what she did with her regret. Time had taught him that forgiveness is not a magic key that reopens doors, but a way of moving forward without carrying old poisons. The most difficult dilemma, however, arose months later, during a casual conversation with Sophia in the late afternoon. Sitting on the balcony of Daniel's apartment, she watched the sunset while telling him that Clara had been diagnosed with severe depression. She said that her mother had days when she wouldn't get out of bed, and that her therapist believed that much of what she was experiencing now was a kind of prolonged mourning. Not because of her marriage, but because of guilt. Sophia, moved, asked him if he thought that one day the three of them could sit down together, she, her father, and her mother, just to end that cycle in a dignified, mature way. Daniel looked at her for a few seconds before answering. He said he wasn't promising anything, but that he would think about it. It wasn't pride. It was protection. Protecting what he had managed to rebuild with effort, protecting his new love, protecting himself from being sucked back into a past he had already decided to leave behind. That night, next to Helena, Daniel reflected on the weight of that request. There was a complex moral dilemma within him: should he keep his peace intact or allow Clara to find some form of final redemption? He didn't hate her. He didn't wish her any harm. But he also didn't want to become the pillar of a regret that wasn't his. Helena, wisely, simply said that she would support him in any decision. That she understood if he wanted to keep his distance, but she also wouldn't judge him if he opted for one last gesture of humanity. Daniel spent days with that question hammering away inside him. He wasn't looking for heroism. Just honesty. And it was that honesty that, a week later, led him to Clara's apartment, without warning, without preparation. She was startled when she saw him at the door, and it took her a while to react. Her hair was tied up in a messy way, she was wearing old clothes, and there was a thick sadness on her face. Daniel didn't say anything right away, he just came in when she let him. They sat in the living room, facing each other. Clara tried to speak, but he interrupted her. He said he wasn't there for her, but for himself. That he needed to end that cycle with dignity. That he wanted to look her in the eyes and tell her he forgave her, but that didn't mean forgetting, or starting over. He said their love had ended, not on the day of the betrayal, but long before, when she stopped fighting for them. Clara cried in silence, absorbing every word. And when he got up to leave, she simply said, "Thank you for giving me back my own truth." He left without looking back. He knew there was nothing more to be said. When he returned home, Helena was waiting for him with a calm look on her face. He approached her and gave her a long, silent hug. They didn't need words. She knew him well enough to understand that that hug was a promise that the past had finally been left behind. And that, from then on, all that was left was to live. Live without fear, without resentment, with the lightness of someone who has faced the worst and still chosen to continue believing in the beauty of starting over. Because, in the end, the hardest part is not forgiving the other person. It's forgiving yourself for having stopped loving yourself for so long. And that, Daniel had finally achieved. In the months following his final reunion with Clara, Daniel's life began to take on a different texture, as if everything that had previously been excessively dense began, little by little, to dissolve into an unexpected peace. It was not the euphoria of a new beginning, nor an anesthesia that tried to disguise the pain, but a rare balance between acceptance and presence. He did not live running away from the past, nor did he deny it. He had simply put it in its rightful place, a closed chapter in a book that, although painful, had taught him more than any other. And it was this awareness that made him get through the days with a serenity he had not known for years. Helena was becoming an increasingly essential part of his routine. Not as someone who filled the voids, but as a presence that expanded spaces. Mornings were shared with fresh coffee and comfortable silences, late afternoons with conversations that ranged from everyday banalities to reflections on everything they had experienced up until that point. It was not a relationship built on the rush to forget, but on the delicacy of remembering that it was possible to love again even after losing someone. And this new construction brought a maturity that Daniel had never had, not with Clara or with any other woman. There was something between them that didn't need to be said all the time. A look was enough to know when to be quiet, when to offer a hug, when to simply exist side by side. One Saturday night, while they were organizing old boxes that Helena had left in a corner of the closet, Daniel found a handwritten letter, carefully folded between two old photos. It was a letter from her husband, written shortly before he passed away. Helena hesitated when she saw him with that paper between his fingers, but she didn't stop him from reading it. Daniel, very carefully, asked if he could continue. She nodded. The reading was silent, but intense. Words of farewell, confessions of fear, but also of peace. Her husband said he hoped that one day she would find someone who would make her laugh again, who would walk by her side with the same admiration he had always had for her. When he finished, Daniel folded the letter back up, looked at Helena with moist eyes and said he hoped he was up to it. She held his hand and, without saying anything, let him know that she was. That she was already there. As his life took on this new shape, Daniel became involved in social projects in the region where he lived. He began giving lectures to men who, like him, had gone through devastating breakups. He spoke not as an expert, but as someone who had survived. His story, told honestly, began to touch other people in a profound way. Men who previously could not put their pain into words began to find it in his testimony. He did not romanticize suffering, but showed that it was possible to overcome loss and not only continue living, but find meaning again. The lectures, which were simple at first, began to attract more people, until they became monthly meetings in small auditoriums. Daniel did not seek recognition. He did it out of necessity. Because speaking out freed. Because his story, transformed into a bridge, gave others what he did not have at the beginning, a path to walk. Sophia, now more confident, had started a psychology course. The choice surprised everyone, but she explained that, after everything they had been through, she wanted to better understand human emotions. She said she needed to understand how people who love each other can get hurt so much, and how new beginnings are possible even after irreparable mistakes. Daniel followed her progress from afar, respecting his daughter's space, but feeling a pride that was hard to describe. She was growing, maturing, building something that he could not have foreseen. And this construction, even if silent, was a kind of redemption for both of them. A cycle that was closing in an unexpected but genuine way. One spring afternoon, while visiting a shelter that had become a partner of his support group, Daniel received an unexpected call. It was Lucas, asking him to come to his grandmother's house. He said only that there was something important to be taken care of. When he arrived, he found Clara sitting on the porch, her face aged more by regret than by time. She was next to her parents, who avoided interfering, but watched everything with tired eyes. Clara asked him to sit down. He said it wouldn't take much time. He was about to sell the house where they had lived together, and he wanted to give her something he had kept for all those years. It was a small wooden box, closed with a faded blue ribbon. When Daniel opened it, he found letters. Letters from her to him, never sent. Written at different times during their marriage, from the early years to the last days before the separation. They contained stories of love, pain, loneliness, guilt. Clara explained that writing was her only way of not going crazy, but that she had never had the courage to give it to him. I thought he wouldn't understand. Now, however, she wanted him to know, even if it was too late, that at no point had she stopped loving him. But that, unfortunately, she had not known how to continue being herself within what their marriage had become. Daniel listened attentively. He read a letter right there. The paper was already yellowed, the handwriting shaky. There was a Clara there that he had never met, a woman who had screamed without a voice for years, who had tried to find meaning and, when she couldn't find it, had lost herself. Was there anger? Maybe a trace, but what predominated was compassion. For the woman who had made a mistake, yes, but also for the woman who had been left alone in a marriage that seemed perfect to the outside world. When he had finished reading, Daniel said that he would keep the letters, not as a reminder of pain, but as a testament to the fact that no one makes mistakes alone. Clara smiled for the first time in a long time. A sad but sincere smile. And she said that she hoped that one day she would be able to write new letters. To herself. Without regret. Only with the truth. On the way home, Daniel drove in silence. The sunset reflected in the rearview mirror as if the universe wanted to paint a metaphor without asking permission. Helena was waiting for him on the porch, sitting with a book on her lap. When she saw him, she closed the book slowly, as if she knew something important had happened. He came over, sat next to her, and handed her one of the letters. Helena held it, but didn't open it. She said she would respect his time. And Daniel replied that she could read it if she wanted. Because now, he was no longer afraid of the past. There was nothing left to hide, nothing to fear. What had once been a shadow was now just part of the landscape. They stood there, side by side, watching the sky change color. And in that silence, there was more complicity than in any dialogue. The following weeks were marked by small gestures of new beginnings. Daniel decided to write a book about his story. Not out of vanity, but because he believed that transforming pain into a narrative was a form of liberation. Helena supported the idea, Sophia promised to help with the technical part, and Lucas had already suggested the title, After Winter. Because that was exactly what that phase represented, rebirth after the most difficult season. The writing process was cathartic. Reliving every detail, organizing the events with emotional distance, offering to paper everything that, for so long, had been stuck between his throat and his chest. And when he finally finished the last chapter, Daniel felt that something inside him had closed for good. There were no more edges. The pain had run its course. And now, all that was left was to live. One Sunday morning, with the book already finished, Daniel and Helena were making coffee together when Sophia hurried through the door. She was carrying a letter from herself in her hands. It said that she had been accepted into an internship program in another country and that she would be leaving in a few weeks. Daniel smiled, held the paper with both hands, looked into his daughter's eyes and said, "Now is your time to live." She replied that she could only do this because he had shown her how to do it. And in that long embrace, there was a silent forgiveness, not only between father and daughter, but between everything that had been left unsaid and what was finally understood. Helena watched from afar, with tears in her eyes and a silent pride. Because she knew that she was beside a man who had not only survived the chaos, but who had chosen to transform his story into a seed. And when someone does that, they no longer carry the chains of the past. They carry roots. And with firm roots, it is possible to grow even in the most arid terrain. Time passed, and with it came the certainty that, even after everything, life had its own rhythm of restoration. Daniel, now with grayer hair and the firm gaze of someone who had faced storms and gone through each one with his head held high, launched his book in a small neighborhood bookstore, surrounded by faces that had marked different phases of his life. Helena was there, by his side, holding his hand with the naturalness of someone who was already part of his story. Sophia, more mature, had on her face the lightness of someone who had finally managed to forgive herself. Lucas, always more discreet, observed everything from afar, with a pride that overflowed in his eyes even though few words came out of his mouth. Clara, in turn, was not physically present, but her absence was felt in a way that only time can explain. She had left the country weeks before for a spiritual retreat in the interior of a distant island, a place that promised reconstruction in silence. His last message simply said that he needed to learn to live without seeking the approval of those he had hurt, and that he hoped, one day, to rediscover the self-love he had lost amidst the rubble of his choices. The launch was simple, intimate, but full of symbolism. Daniel read an excerpt from the book, the one that talked about new beginnings, not as moments of euphoria, but as silent gestures that reveal courage. The audience listened attentively, some moved, others reflective. He was not a renowned author, but his story touched deeply because it was real. It was about pain, about loss, about rebuilding. When he finished reading, he looked up and said that he never imagined he would be the voice of anyone, but that if his story helped just one person get out of the hole he himself was in, then it would all have been worth it. He received a standing ovation, not for the book, but for the courage of having exposed his own soul. In the months that followed, the book took on a life of its own. It was circulated in support groups, in community libraries, was read at family gatherings, and was even cited in ethics and human relations classes. Daniel began to be sought out by people who saw themselves reflected in its pages, and each story he heard served as reinforcement that pain is never unique. Everyone carries scars. The difference lies in how we choose to deal with them. He was now living proof that it is possible to transform pain into a bridge, mourning into learning, betrayal into a new beginning. But what surprised him most was that the more he listened to other people, the more he understood that his story, as remarkable as it was just one among many. And this took away the burden of feeling like a victim and put him in the position of a survivor, something infinitely more powerful. Helena, in turn, continued to be the silent center of Daniel's balance. She didn't seek the spotlight, she didn't want recognition. She knew that her presence there wasn't to replace anyone, but to share the path. The love between them grew so solidly that, over time, they began to receive messages from younger couples asking for advice, wanting to understand how to build a love without ego, without rushing, without fear. They didn't give formulas. They just repeated that everything starts with respect. And that respect is born from acknowledging the other's pain. It was this respect that led them, a year later, to decide to make their union official in a simple ceremony, in an open field, where each guest carried a part of their journey. Sophia was responsible for the vows, and her words moved even the most resistant. She spoke about rebuilding, about the importance of forgiveness, but mainly about how much she learned that true love never imposes, only offers. Lucas was responsible for delivering the rings. As he placed them on his father and Helena's fingers, he looked into their eyes and said that if he ever had a wedding, he hoped it would be half of what he saw there. Clara found out about the ceremony through a phone call from Sophia. When she heard the details, she cried on the other end of the line. Not out of anger or jealousy, but out of a still-living regret that recognized how much she had lost due to decisions made without listening, without care, without awareness. She wished her happiness, said she was fine, that she was learning to be self-sufficient. Sophia sensed a deep sadness in her mother's voice, but at the same time, a kind of resigned peace. She would not return. Not as a figure of redemption, nor as a shadow of the past. Only as a memory of what was, of what should not have been, and of what now served as a silent warning. In the last months of that year, Daniel was invited to participate in a documentary about emotional reconstruction after marital betrayal. He accepted, with the only condition that the focus would always be on the message, not on personal exposure. On the day of the recording, in front of the cameras, he said that he was not there as an example, but as a consequence of very difficult decisions. That forgiving was an act of courage, but rebuilding self-confidence was an act of self-love. And that, if he could leave just one message for those listening, it would be this: betrayal does not begin at the moment of the hidden kiss or the lie told. It begins much earlier, when you stop caring, listening, choosing the other person every day. And it destroys not only what you have, but who you are. Not because of the pain of the act itself, but because of the absence of truth. At the end of that day, walking hand in hand with Helena, he stopped in front of a lake and looked at the reflection in the water. He said that for a long time he thought that reflection was all that would be left of him, a distorted, broken image. But now he saw that the reflection only showed what was on the surface. The depth, that can only be known by diving. And he had dived. And survived. And so, over time, each character in that story found their destiny. Clara, in silence, dedicated herself to volunteering at a home for women in the process of rebuilding. Sophia began giving talks to young people about emotional choices and started a support group for children of separated couples. Lucas opened a small production company for emotional content focused on stories of overcoming difficulties. And Daniel, now recognized as someone who translated his pain into light, continued living. Not as a martyr, but as a whole man. A man who learned, at the worst moment in his life, that pain is a cruel teacher, but that only pain teaches us where we are truly broken. Now tell me, what did you think of this story? Did it touch you in any way? Leave your comment below, we want to know your opinion. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel to continue receiving real, exciting stories that make us reflect on the paths we take. And remember, cheating is never worth it. It doesn't just destroy relationships, but also souls, stories, futures. There is no justification for hurting someone you love. And here on this channel, we make it clear, we do not support any kind of cheating. All the stories here are fictional, created to show how wrong choices can change lives forever. Always choose respect. Always choose love. Because in the end, it's the only thing that remains.